The word path is defined as a route, a course, or a track on which something moves. Dreams shape the path one envisions traveling. Life redefines it into a way, beaten, formed, or trodden by the footprints of a person. That person leads us to an unexpected encounter that connects two or more points, one's dreams and one's reality. The path that connects dreams to reality is one's destiny.
My name is Chad Judice. I'm a husband, a father, been in Catholic education for 14 years. I'm a award-winning author and a national speaker. In May of 2005, a former student asked me a question I'd never been asked before. He said, "Hey coach, what's your greatest fear?" And I told him my greatest fear would be to have a child with a mental or physical handicap. Because I was such a perfectionist, I didn't think I'd handle that very well. And 4 years later, that greatest fear had become my reality.
Me and Chad met in college, probably my junior year, and then we just kind of started dating. It was quite nice, and just kind of took off from there. We were so excited in 2004 we found out we were pregnant. We had waited a little while, kind of had things planned, buy a house, pay off a car, everything. Everybody has their little sets of plans, things you want to do before you have your baby. Ephraim was great. He was fun. Toddler, just having a good time. Really a great first baby to want another one. Didn't take long, found out we were pregnant, second month, really excited. We had gone on a little vacation and came back home, and for Father's Day he found out we were pregnant.
In the midst of our second pregnancy and a 16-week ultrasound, my wife and I found out that our second child was diagnosed with a severe birth defect.
She said they're having trouble finding part of his brain. We're going to set you up to see a specialist tomorrow, but we think he may have spina bifida.
It's a neural tube defect that occurs in the first 6 weeks of pregnancy and literally means open spine. There are different types of spina bifida with different degrees of severity. Eli had the most severe form of spina bifida. 80% of the couples choose to terminate the pregnancy. 75% of children with this type of birth defect would cause an inexplainable or unexplainable miscarriage prior to 20 weeks of pregnancy. As we read on further that night, we found out that within 24 to 72 hours after birth, he would need major surgery on his spinal cord and on his brain. And even if both of those surgeries were successful, doctors said he would never walk, and he would be severely mentally disabled, and he would have several health problems.
We had so much information and not really knowing anything, and that for us was really hard. We had great support. We had a lot of people praying. It was just a really hard night. It's hard knowing that your child's going to be born with issues. It may not have the life that you want for them, but you don't know, it's more, I think a lot of people have, we say, oh, the poor kid's going to suffer, but I think it's more us. We're worried about how it's going to affect our life, not basically, their life. We don't always realize that.
I got into Catholic education at Cathedral Carmel in May of 2001. Stayed there 4 years till May of 2005, and then jumped to St. Thomas More, which I was there for 9 years, and loved my students, loved teaching high school kids. I got to the point in the year where my students knew that I really cared about them and really had an interest in them. And when I walked in that classroom the day after getting the diagnosis with my wife, and I was standing in front of a group of boys, I remember the hour. It's a group of young men very much like I was when I was in high school. And all day long I kept thinking, the only class I can't break down in is this one. And would you know that that's the one where I got really emotional, and I got up in front of the class and I said, listen, we start every class with a prayer. I said, I don't know if, what your faith life is like, but it's all I have right now. I said, there's something wrong with my son. And as I began to try to pray, I really got very emotional. I began to weep, and I couldn't stop. And you could just heard a pin drop in the room. And there was a young lady, a real tiny girl in the back of the class. She began to pray the Our Father because I couldn't pray. And as she began to pray, the voices of these young men, who I thought I would completely lose in that moment, they began to pray so loud and so hard. They'd been kind of going through the motions up until that day, but that day they were really praying really hard. And it was one of the most memorable things I think I've ever had happen in the classroom. And it let me know that God was there and that it was going to be all right.
Chad did not ever put on like everything was okay. When things were challenging, things were tough. When things were really pressing him on what he really believed down deep in his heart. He was very real about the whole journey.
The day after Chad informed me that his son, his unborn son, was diagnosed with spina bifida, we had an all-school mass. And after mass, I had an opportunity to give some announcements for campus ministry. And I told Chad to wait a moment, that while I gave the announcements, I had something to say. And with his permission, I got before the whole student body and faculty and all the parents present, and I invited the school to pray with me for a miracle, to pray for the safe birth and delivery of his son.
Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women. My spirituality, which had been part of my life and on the outside of my life, really became the center of my life. Jesus Christ became the center of my life. I began to pray and ask him to heal my son. And as I began to do that, I was joined by scores of students and parents and people in the community who lifted up my family and carried us through what I would say at that point would have been the worst thing that ever happened in my life. But the beauty of me sitting here today is saying that no, actually it was the best thing that ever happened in my life.
When Eli was born, I had a cesarean section to get him out to make sure that we didn't damage any of his cord that was exposed.
Him being born on that Tuesday morning in February of 2009, and when he was born, discovering that the birth defect, that the opening in his back, it should have been the size of a softball, was the size of a 50-cent piece, and that he could do things physically that medical science said he would never be able to do, was really encouraging. He did face 2 major surgeries, one on his spinal cord and his brain, within 24 to 72 hours after his birth. And after recovering from that and eventually making it home, I never knew what it was like to be a NICU parent. My wife's a neonatal nurse at Women's and Children's Hospital, and I always marveled at what she did, especially when she was carrying Eli to term, trying to carry a baby in utero while knowing on the outside you were caring for other people's children who faced similar circumstances. That was a pretty amazing thing, and it's there that I was inspired to begin writing. I had nothing in my possession but a laptop, and I began to write what I thought would be the introduction, but ended up being the first chapter of the book. And as I wrote down the introduction, something inside of me began to move in a way that it had never moved before. I've always loved to write, but I never had anything I was passionate enough or convicted enough to write about. And as I began to write then, it just started to flow, and it wouldn't stop.
Chad started writing, I think, therapeutically for himself, just trying to get his thoughts together, help him deal with what's going on. He's always been a great writer. He'd written a few poems for me while we were dating. Really kind of cool. He's just really good with his emotions when he lets himself be. I think it was more to tell the story to Ephraim, what happened, why we were gone, how we were feeling, how he felt as a dad, as a man.
I'd never been so convicted or dedicated about finishing anything in my life that I'd started. And I played it out, finished the manuscript, and I gave it to a friend at school who ended up giving it to my publisher.
This project came to my attention in the summer of 2009. I was at the office, bent over a desk editing on a tight deadline, and one of Chad's colleagues at St. Thomas More High School in Lafayette came in with a manuscript, and promptly one of my employees brought it in for me to take a look at, and he said to me, this lady from St. Thomas More brought the manuscript, and she says, you've got to read this, and I know that you're going to want to publish it. Rather than leave it at the office, I brought it home to put it in my reading stack at home. My wife recognized the author's name, Chad Giudice, and she said, I recognize that name, let me take a look at the manuscript. So 20 minutes later, she's in tears, she's crying, she's moved by the manuscript, and she says to me, you've got to read this. I said, what is it about this book? So I picked it up, and I figured I'd read a page or two to glean what it was there. And first thing you know, I read 2 pages and 3 pages, and I was done with the chapter. And then first thing you know, I'm into the second chapter and the third chapter, and it's starting to captivate my imagination. It really has my attention. I'm pulling for the dad who has a child who is coming with spina bifida. I'm pulling for the mom, and I'm pulling for the child. An empathy had been created just pretty much instantaneously. And so it sunk in pretty much on the first reading that this is one of the books, perhaps, that I was put on this earth to publish.
We need a powerful, unashamed, passionate, true story that we as human beings can connect to. We all go through our own suffering. We all want to know when we're suffering that it's going to be okay. How do I make it when I feel like all is lost? Chad Giudice's writing and his speaking is that true story.
But a lot of people would think, well, how could you carry a kid knowing that they're going to have all these problems? Why would you do that to your child? He's great. I mean, he knows he has some limitations, but everybody does. Everybody's got a limitation for something, whether it's brains or beauty or, learning. Everybody has some limitation. His is just different.
Come get the babies. Come on. Come get the babies.
He really progressed a lot. He was getting around, getting up. He went from being in a what we called a chariot, where he would be able to roll himself around and be just erect the first year of his life. He moved from that to what we now have him in, which is a pair of Orgios and a walker. We're at therapy now. He can actually, walk a certain bit of distance. And I find that to be miraculous, because if you know a lot about spina bifida and you locate the area on his spinal cord where his lesion is, typically a child with his condition, as severe as it was, if they have a lesion that high, they shouldn't be able to walk at all. And the fact that he can even walk with assistance is pretty amazing.
He can swim across a pool by himself, just using his arms, which alone is an amazing feat for most 5-year-olds, much less one that can't use his legs.
He also has a shunt, which regulates the neural fluid that flows from his brain and his spinal cord, and that's caused a couple of issues. He has epilepsy, and so he's prone to seizures, and that's really only been the last couple of years of his life. But despite all those problems, having medication every time, during a time every day, having to be catheterized, and having to deal with all that, he's still the happiest kid I know. And he really inspires me whenever I'm faced with any kind of difficulty to realize that it's not really that difficult. And it puts a lot of things in perspective for me and for our family.
Ephraim and Eli are like any two brothers. They fight. They love each other. They take care of each other. They know, kind of reiterate, you're not going to have anybody be like your brother or your sister. Take care of them.
You can do it. Come on. The pediatric neurosurgeon told us that at the center of Eli's brain, he was born with something called an abnormal cyst. It wasn't unusual for kids with the type of condition that he had. He told us that as Eli grew older, the cyst would grow with him, and at some point it could cause a problem in the future. Holy Week of 2011 and Easter of 2011 is one that my family and I will never forget. That cyst that his neurosurgeon had mentioned 2 years earlier became an immense problem that week. Early during the week, he seemed lethargic. He was showing all the classic symptoms that there was a shunt malfunction. And my wife took him into Tulane University Medical Center in downtown New Orleans. And his neurosurgeon adjusted the setting on his shunt magnetically. So that was a positive thing, because it meant that we could avoid a possible brain surgery. And he appeared to be doing well. So about midweek that week, she came back home to Lafayette, and on Good Friday I was sitting outside with my son watching him play in a swimming pool with his cousins, happy as can be, the best I'd seen him look in a really long time. The following morning I woke up on Holy Saturday, and my wife had left to go to work. And I got him out of bed, and I put him on the ground in the den. And when I looked at him, I realized that he looked worse than he had the following Monday.
He's kind of listless. He doesn't want to play, and it was Easter weekend. They were hiding Easter eggs, coloring, doing all the things he loves to do, and he had no interest.
So I knew something was wrong. I called my mother-in-law, who's also an RN. She came to pick him up and said, "Let me watch him for a little while, and if it gets worse, I'll call you." And as I was getting up to leave, the phone rang, probably 40 minutes after she left with him. And she said, "Meet me at the hospital in Lafayette." When I got to Women's and Children's that afternoon, they did a CT scan on him, showing that there was a huge blockage of fluid in the shunt, and it was probably being caused by the cyst. And my wife had to leave work with him on an ambulance that day about midday. And they were driving to New Orleans on the ambulance. And about halfway there, he had a seizure.
We had to stop at an emergency room on the way there. Got him settled. My parents and my husband were in another vehicle. My oldest was with my in-laws for the weekend.
He got there on Holy Saturday around 7 or 8 o'clock at night. His neurosurgeon called his team in, and he went into emergency surgery. He started around 10 o'clock in the evening, and he came out about 3 in the morning. He just looked totally exhausted. And he said, I think we got it fixed. So they moved him into the PICU. We spent the night, overnight, the rest of the night, in a room next to the PICU. And we woke up the next morning, it was Easter Sunday. And we went in to see him in the PICU. And he had all these tubes coming out of his mouth, and he was still under the anesthesia. He hadn't come out of it yet. And he looked like he was going to be okay. So my wife and I decided to make Mass.
We were in Mass. My mom called and said, the shunt's not working. They need you to come back. They need to take him into surgery now.
So we ran from the church down the street back to the hospital. And when we got into the hospital, they had taken him into surgery on Easter Sunday around noon. And it lasted till about 4 or 5 in the afternoon. When we came out, the surgeon said again, okay, I think I've got it. I mean, I had to maneuver some tubing around his cyst, but I watched on the monitor and everything's fine. So being relieved, I left, and I went to stay with some folks who had put us up when Eli was first born so I could take a shower. And as I got out of the shower that night, my wife called me back and said, you need to come back because they're thinking they're going to have to do surgery again tomorrow morning. I got in the car and I drove back there, and when I got there, I went online to the computer, and there had been a guy whose shrine is about maybe a mile or two away from Tulane University Medical Center. He's not canonized a saint, but he is beatified. His name is Blessed Francis Xavier Silos, and I had prayed to him repeatedly for the past year in the chapel at St. Thomas More, asking him to ask Jesus to remove the cyst from my son's head. I didn't have the prayer I had prayed, so I went online and I found it on the website and I printed it out. That night I walked back into the PICU and I stood next to my son's bed and I prayed the prayer. And it goes, oh my God, I truly believe you are present with me. I adore your limitless perfections. I thank you for the graces and gifts you gave to Father Silos. If it is your holy will, please let him be declared a saint of the church, so others may know and imitate his holy life. Through his prayer and intercession, please give me the following favor. And I asked Jesus, through the intercession of Blessed Silos and Our Lady, to shrink my son's cyst so he wouldn't need surgery the following morning. I prayed a rosary, and I left the bedside. The following morning I woke up, and my mother-in-law was in the PICU with my wife, and she walked back into the waiting room and said, you need to go in there and see him because the doctor wants to speak with you guys. So I walked in, and I was standing next to his bed, and they had shaved all of his hair off. He had a tube running out of his mouth, and he really hadn't come out of consciousness from the anesthesia from the night before. So he just started to kind of wrap his little hand around my finger, and I really could kind of feel him squeezing it. And I felt a tap on my shoulder, and it was the doctor, and he said, I want you and your wife to come with me. So we left him by the bedside, we walked in, and the room was completely empty. It was just him and his assistant. And he began to explain to us how they had attempted to do one thing on Saturday night that would have decreased the size of the cyst over a period of time. And when it appeared that had not worked, they went in again on Sunday, attempted that again, thought they had it done on Easter Sunday. And then that night after that surgery was over with, another CT scan showed that there was a good possibility that he would need another surgery. But based on what they had seen early that morning when they brought him in, they realized that he probably would not need another surgery. And that for whatever reason, that a cyst that should have taken months to decrease in size had decreased in size by over 75% overnight. And he said, I'm planning on writing a medical study on this because in 40 years of practicing pediatric neurosurgery, I've never seen anything like this. And 2 days later, after I had a visitor who had come to pray over Eli leave, and I was walking him out to his car, and I went back up to the PICU to see him. My wife said, you'll never guess who just came by here. I said, who? She said, a priest from the Silos Center. And he prayed over Eli, and he had left the same prayer I had prayed 2 nights earlier next to my son's bedside on his pillow. 2 days later, we left the hospital, and it's been 4 years since then, and we haven't been back.
You try to go out? You can't. Dad, give it!
his son Elijah, although in the world's eyes may be somewhat disabled physically because of spina bifida, would impact people, that he would bring people to Jesus Christ through his story, and that Elijah's little life would transform other lives.
That has inspired me to never give up, to always have hope, to always fight, to journey with my wife and not isolate when things get tough, and to be okay with where God's got me at any given moment, knowing that he hasn't ever abandoned me.
You know, I think one of the things I did realize throughout all this process was that I had been taking so many things in my life for granted, and that, you know, when my first son was born, everything went great. We had a, you know, typical 9-month pregnancy, no complications. He came out, he was healthy, no problems. I really took it for granted. And now after going through this experience with my son, I see that, you know, this stuff that we encountered with Eli, what we went through, it's not as uncommon as you might think. I've met lots of people who are in situations as bad, if not worse, than the one we're in. And when I meet people like that, I never stop and say, you know, I wish my life was different. I think having Eli here and having this life has been a great blessing, and really taught me a lot about the fact that my son was never the one who needed work on him. You know, God didn't need to work on Eli. He needed to work on me. You're killing me, man. You're killing me. I can't keep up. I can't keep up. I can't keep up. Come on. Grab off the thing you need, buddy.
I don't need you.
He's such a trooper. I can't stand or really have trouble dealing with as a dad being next to his bedside and seeing him getting poked and prodded and examined and seeing him being scared or frightened. And as a protective father, I want to go in and I want to take that away from him, and I want to take it on myself. And I'm unable to do that. But what inspires me at the same time about him is that it never gets him down. Once we get past that point, he's so grown up about it. I call him a happy little soul, because his soul and his demeanor go well beyond 5 years of age. And he handles those situations in a way that I think are so amazing. And I really think that's one of the biggest fruits of his life, and one of the high points in the midst of a low point, is that he inspires me. When I get up to talk in front of a large group of people, if there's any butterflies or there's any nervousness or any anxiety or anything keeping me from letting go and doing whatever it is I need to do to allow the Lord to deliver whatever message he wants to deliver to those people, what I see before I start, after I get through praying with the audience, when I close my eyes and open my eyes through the prayer, is my son after he's gotten an IV put in his arm, and he's been poked 3 or 4 times, and he's about to be let off at 4.5 years old to get an MRI done on his head and on his spinal cord, and he's laughing, going out of the door. I used to teach history for a long time, so next to seeing somebody take a bullet for somebody that's on the battlefield next to them, I think watching my son walk out of that room with that demeanor might be one of the most courageous things I've ever seen in my life.
Through Eli's life, we witnessed so many different miracles and different things going on. And just him being here, number one, big miracle. How many things have to go right for a baby to be born, much less be born healthy, which he was healthy, just with some issues. And then that he constantly amazes us. I mean, he was able to walk. We didn't think he'd be able to do that with braces. He's so smart.
Y-O-U spells you.
That's right.
I just graduated from Miss Allison's class. Now I'm going to kindergarten, and then kindergarten has homework. And then after that, what else? Oh, Wait, after kindergarten, where am I going? First grade and second grade and third grade.
He has seizures, and he comes out of them remarkably well. And just that he's got a happy outlook. You know, for a kid being so sick to be so happy all the time is just unreal. You know, just because for us, we're like, we hit our toe and we're cranky all day long. You know, he has a seizure and he's happy.
You know, I think back, we were leaving that hospital room in New Orleans and we were driving home. I looked back in the back seat and my son's head is bald and he's smiling at me. And I thought back to the beginning about how all the people had prayed so hard for the ultimate miracle. He'd be completely healed. Had that happen, it would have been acknowledged, but it would have been forgotten. And instead, I found that God's reach into the lives of others through his imperfections has really made Eli's story timeless. And it's a story that would have ended in the darkness of an ultrasound room if my wife and I would never have said yes to life. I don't ever ask myself during the day, why me, or look for a different life. I think my life is exactly the way it's supposed to be. I believe that things happen in this world for a reason. And I think they all draw us to a point where we're called to be bigger than who we think we can be. And we find something within ourselves that we'd have never found had we never been posed with that situation. And Eli's life and the impact it's had on other people is what motivates me. It's what drives me to see the selflessness it brings out in his brother, to see what it brings out in my parents and my in-laws and to the people that he encounters, and to see how it has taken any fear that I've had of anything and totally thrown it aside. And it's been replaced with a love so great that welcoming another child into the world after that experience should have been very fearful and frightful and difficult. And instead it was uplifting and it was challenging. But it's drawn me out of myself in a greater way than even Eli did. And that would have not happened if we had not had the experience that we had. So I sit here today, entering my 14th year in Catholic education, continuing a speaking career, as a loving husband and a father, those being the two most important things in my life. Looking at my life today, and if someone had asked me 10 or 11 years ago, where do you see yourself 10 years from now? It certainly wouldn't have been here. But sometimes in life, all it takes is a leap of faith and walking down the path less traveled to find everything you ever thought you'd been looking for, and you'll find it.
Someone who's used media a lot in evangelization, so I believe in the importance of Catholic radio, Catholic TV, Catholics using the new media. Can I encourage everyone to watch Shalom TV? I think it's a great vehicle of evangelization. And God bless all of you.
Shalom World, God's own channel.